said, I'm going to invite various people to come up and just sit here and we'll do Q&A for, you know, a little while. So I don't know if anyone wants to kick off with some questions, but we've got a little bit of time here, and I thank you all for coming. Yeah, Alex.
What can we do to get Twiggy and Tanya somewhere better, and the other elephants?
Who'd like to start us off? I mean, maybe Chris, would you like to just sort of start us with that, and then I'll probably ask almost everyone for their own opinion on that particular question, because it's probably the one that's sitting right there on the front of your consciousness.
What there needs to be soon, quickly, is somewhere better. Currently we could, with the best will in the world, we could maybe shuffle a few elephants around captive facilities in Europe, but there isn't a dedicated elephant sanctuary like the one you saw at the end of the film.
Could they not go to that one?
The logistics of moving older, quite often elderly and infirm elephants that huge distance is not impossible, but it's massively difficult undertaking. So I firmly am of the opinion that there needs to be a dedicated sanctuary type facility in Europe. And without that, we will only be tinkering around the edges.
Rob? Because you've sort of looked into this a little bit.
Yes, a sanctuary is the answer, hopefully a temporary answer, because one's looking at the lifespan of current elephants and maybe their offspring, or possibly their offspring, and then after that you really don't want any more in captivity. So a sanctuary that lasted 150 years would probably do it, see the end of elephants in zoos in Europe, unless zoos can somehow get their act together very, very quickly. But then they'd be operating almost as a sanctuary anyway, with huge areas. We're talking hundreds of acres. Now that's not easy to do at all without raising awareness, and your question was, what can we do? I think the best thing is to support the efforts of people like Tariq and Amanda and the team. I think that the question of making the long version of this film is just really important. I think that the next thing is to make an hour-long documentary that really goes into not covering any new ground, which I think you've covered it all pretty well, but there's a lot more data that makes it even more impactful. The things like the short lifespans that were mentioned in there, there's lots more about stereotypy and sickness and obesity and the number of babies that die, which you couldn't get in. So there's all sorts of room, and I think that would really, really help. That would really help. So anything anyone can do to help that effort.
I'm going to ask Adam, I'm going to steer this a little bit, because obviously Rob says we've got to raise awareness, but also to create something that would require a significant amount of money. And your thoughts on that, and perhaps, if I might nudge you, compared to what is spent on elephant enclosures in zoos, might add some perspective to this.
Sure, well, it's a perfect question to ask, first of all, because I always say, whether I'm doing an event like this or I'm going to a meeting among colleagues or grassroots activists anywhere in the world, the important thing is not what happens in this room, it's what happens when we all leave this room, right? We all need to see this film and decide, now we're going to do something. We're going to make it a personal mission, much as it's become a personal mission for some of us for years, and for Tariq and others now, to make a difference and end this misery that we've now been exposed to. And for me, some of this is new, right? I haven't seen these clips before, and I don't know what it's like seeing some of these lone elephants in zoos in Eastern Europe. I do know, and I'll just say as an aside, and I will answer your question, that what always fascinates me about these things, especially as an American, is I think when people in America see this film, they're going to automatically have this concept of, well, that happens so far away. Oh, so that's what it's like in Eastern Europe. That doesn't happen here. But if you go into the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., where I live, you'll see the same sort of concrete indoor enclosure for the elephants there. I noticed there was a black rubber ball in that little pool, and we had the same thing in our elephant enclosure, except the ball was red. Otherwise, it was the exact same thing. And we're in Washington, D.C., where we have access to tens of millions of dollars to put into enclosure upgrades. And so, and this picks up, I think, on all the themes that we talked about in that film, you know, you put literally tens of millions of dollars to go from sort of a quarter acre to a half an acre, a quarter acre to an acre, to accommodate more elephants, to put in some rubber tires for environmental enrichment. And, you know, Joyce said in the film, it's like living in your bathroom your whole life. And I don't I've always said, when I look at these sorts of situations, imagine just being told you can never leave your house. You know, I have a TV, and I have air conditioning and heating, and I have a wife and kids. Maybe that's part of my penance, but nonetheless, I have all the things that I could possibly want. But at some point, I'm going to get cabin fever, right? At some point, I'm going to want to leave my home, whether I'm just stuck in the bathroom or not. So I think this is what it's all about, is deciding that we're going to make our voice heard by making their voice heard, and that's how we make a difference. And raising some money, not only to spread the message of the film around, but also, as Will hints, raise money to start this elephant sanctuary in Europe as opposed to bigger enclosures for more elephants and zoos.
Virginia?
Well, we all have heard the expression, the elephant in the room, many, many times over the past years. And it's a sort of saying now. But it's not a saying for the elephants that we've just been watching. It's the reality of life. These solitary victims are trapped in a room. Some rooms are slightly bigger than others, but they are rooms from which there is absolutely no escape. And I personally feel deeply ashamed that in this so-called enlightened 21st century, and talking about and thinking about animals with the same kind of emotional sensitivity as human beings, how can this still be going on? I've always believed, in a funny way, that elephants have all the good qualities of people, but none of the bad ones. Elephants are hugely generous, kind, loving to their own families, protective, loyal. We fall short many times of those wonderful qualities. Elephants never do. They bury their dead with the most absolute sensitivity, touching the tusks, burying with leaves and branches. They are the most extraordinary examples of how living creatures should be. And we have betrayed them. We absolutely have betrayed them. The answer is first of all changing hearts and minds. And I would suggest that the first step is the young. This short film, which even children of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old could sit through mesmerized, should be shown in schools around the country. Not only in this country. They could make a translation of the dialogue, of the narration, and be shown in the countries where these animals live. Now, that's just a first step. To persuade our leaders to actually allow some kind of expression to these creatures, which we still keep in circuses, which we still keep in captivity, which we still keep in the most appalling conditions, as you've just seen, and that's just a snapshot, should be very humbling for our leaders. Unfortunately, they don't all look at life in the way we do. But for me, life has to be inclusive. It has to be about all creatures. And if we have really any genuine humility, any genuine feeling for the wild creatures of our world, which we seem to be rather short of at the moment in many ways, this could be the most wonderful first step. A wonderful sanctuary, which we are going to start investigating, the possibility of that. That is a reality. But that is just a wonderful, huge sticking plaster. The real aim would be to leave elephants where they should live, in the wild, with their families, with their young, with their old, to be themselves. We like to be ourselves, as bounded we are by our restrictions of daily life in this modern world. But they should be left in peace to be just themselves. And I think this film will encourage young and old, and everyone who can take 10 or 12 minutes to watch it. I think this message will be hugely inspiring, and I'm so grateful to Tariq and Amanda for doing this for elephants.
Tariq, you've heard some fairly strong support, I would suggest.
Yeah, we're extremely honoured to have that support. I mean, the issue at hand is obviously a very, very serious one, and once we came across that report, I think it's called Innocent Prisoner, written by Chris here. The facts were there. We read the report back to back, and it was like, okay, this is a serious issue. A couple of things I'd like to point out. I think I'm not going to add anything else to answer the question itself, but I'm just going to point out a few things. Again, on zero, well, maybe not zero, but as close to zero as as we could to make something this good, if I may say so. We have got people who we've shown the film to in private have been so moved they've actually volunteered themselves in different parts of Europe to actually translate the film. So right now we have Spanish, we have Italian, we have Polish, we have Norwegian. We don't have French and German yet, but we're getting there. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd say is, as editor as well, I directed the film, but as editor as well, one of the harsh realities of editing is, you've got hours and hours of the most compelling content, and you have to cut it down. And that's normal for editors, but there's a lot that goes amiss. There's a lot of questions that you will have right now. I know you'll have it that were not addressed in the film, perhaps, and perhaps that's where the question of the longer version comes in. But one thing that was cut out that I think I should add was said by Dr. Joyce Poole in Norway when we went to interview her, which was, when it comes to young people, children, we as adults, instead of encouraging their natural instinct to ask why, we suppress that when we take them to the zoo and ask them and almost force them to enjoy watching these animals being imprisoned. And that was something that occurred to me whilst making this film, that actually that's what's happening. And Dr. Joyce said, what are we teaching these, what are we teaching our children? We're teaching them that it's okay to do this. That's what we're teaching them. And although we couldn't include it in the film, hopefully at some point in the near future we will have the full versions of these interviews for those that are interested on the website. There's currently a section for that. Hopefully in the coming days it will be up. I think that's all I'd like to say.
It's an extraordinarily important point, I think, that last point, because it resonates with things that when Born Free was established in 1984, then called ZooCheck, it was exactly that that we discussed night after night, was the fact that because your grandparents or your parents took you to the zoo as a child, it reinforced the notion of captivity as a good thing, as a treat, as a holiday, as something to be looked forward to, enjoyed. And you're quite right, the subtext is to suppress all the questions that you naturally have as a child, which is, why is the animal here? What are we doing? Is it okay? And all those are pushed out of sight and out of mind by the zoo experience, and even more so in the circus experience, where for 2 hours you are asked to suspend the real world in its entirety and to live in this bubble of music and razzmatazz and the ringmaster and the whip and the sawdust and the horses and the animals that come and do things that animals were not designed to do, and then you walk away again. So I think that's a really important point that you've raised there. And I just wanted to, before I ask for another question, I just wanted to pick up on Adam's point about the money. Just to give you one piece of context, the Los Angeles Zoo has just recently completed a new elephant enclosure. The old one was 1.6 acres and the new one is 2.1 acres. So it's gone up a bit. And in that elephant enclosure they've got a male and 2 females. They keep them separate, and the females are post-reproductive anyway. So there is no prospect of breeding. The male has some serious foot problems and other issues. It looks a little bit like Alcatraz in the middle, where they have the actual barn area. And the cost of that 2.1 acres is $42 million US. And we reflect as both animal welfareists and conservationists of what we could do with 1/10 of that. Even 100th of that, quite frankly. $420,000, what could we do? And I think that we need to look at the zoo proposition, the captive proposition in the round, and understand how deficient it is in so many, many ways. Right, having done that, at the back, and then I'll come to the front.
It seems very obvious when you watch it that the issue of isolated elephants is very plain and simple. But I was just wondering, I mean, as soon as I watch it, I'm constantly asking myself, so what about group elephants? What about zoos that keep elephants in smaller groups? So I was just wondering, what role could zoos play? And do you think zoos are being progressive about that slightly wider issue? Because I feel like it's quite a natural follow-on.
Cherry, do you want to start?
Yeah, I just
but
want
I'm
to say,
going to come to, and then I'll come to Chris and Rob, because it's a sort of zoo technical issue as well.
I just want to say something very quickly about that. I learned a lot, as any filmmaker or journalist would do whilst studying a certain topic. I learned so much. One of the things I learned was, when it comes to these elephants, there's certain things which are completely intractable. They are inherent in the process of keeping an animal in captivity. For example, taking them from their natural habitat, from their environment with their families, ripping them apart, and then transporting them thousands of miles in whatever mode of transport to a place where the climate is not of what they're acclimatized to. Their bodies are not designed to cope with that kind of environment. And then, of course, on top of all of that, the isolated elephants are isolated. So there's the question of isolation is perhaps one of extent. Elephants that are captive in any case suffer these, and then the ones that are isolated have this additional layer of horror.
Rob, do you want to pick up on the role of, are zoos being progressive, number one, and if they are, how do they demonstrate that progressiveness in relation to their keeping of elephants, or do they?
It's really, I think it's a difficult question to answer simply. Are they being progressed? I guess they have progressed in the last 100 years or so. There's more awareness of what animals need, and for some species, a threshold has been crossed, such that, for instance, animals which were never breeding for decades, then somebody found a magic trigger and they did start breeding. Now that doesn't mean to say that welfare is secure. As you know, people are bred in concentration camps, but it shows that husbandry can sort of reach a threshold and then suddenly things improve. The question is, for elephants, have they improved enough? Elephants have been bred pretty much since they first came into captivity, but hardly at all in the early days, and it really isn't going well at all. I mean, African elephants in Europe breed rather better than Asian elephants do. Asian elephants, and everybody admits this, I mean even the zoo scientists admit this, that without importation there will be a decline of elephant populations, particularly fast for Asians. So in other words, with all the money that's gone into it and all the attempts to breed them, they still can't do it well enough. So they're declining. So they're having to draw from the range states. So it places a huge question mark over their role for conservation when you're having to take animals from the range states to bring them into captivity. I know lots, I've worked in zoos for many years, I know lots of zoo people, I know lots of zoos, many of them care deeply. It's just that they're just confronted with the daily reality of having to deal with them, and they can't think about the bigger questions. And then some zoo manager will say, we can't afford to lose elephants because the public will stop coming. And you can present them with examples from Edinburgh and London and all sorts of places, but they still don't quite have the courage to stop it. And in fact, I think that one thing that we could all do is empower those people in zoos who don't want them anymore. And there are lots of them, don't you think, Chris?
Yeah,
I think there are lots of them they're big, expensive, they spend their whole time pacing backwards and forwards, they have letters of people every week complaining about it. They put males and females, they don't breed, they're great heralding a new birth. Within a few weeks, they're often dead within a year. 30% are dead within a year of these babies, and then we go through it all again. There are diseases like, that one you're going to tell me,
elephant
endotheliotrophic
virus.
That one, and tuberculosis, and they hardly exist in the wild. They're an artifact of captivity. They are an absolute nightmare to keep. And so, in terms of the question, which was what can zoos do, I honestly think I don't know why they persist with them, because the trouble is when you have an animal that's so obviously badly kept, and there's lots and lots of data now. There's 15, 20 scientific papers in the last 10 years or so, all pointing the same way. that people wonder whether they're doing right by all the other animals. And they seem to think if we lose elephants, then it'll just be a domino effect and we'll lose everything. And I think it won't be like that at all, because while they're claiming that this is conservation and successful, it casts a shadow over everything else they do. I mean, I think that shadow was rightly cast myself, but I don't know why they do it. But that's something that we can think about, is actually working with them.
Chris, I mean, I suppose just to sort of take that question in a slightly different direction, has zoo captive care kept pace with current understanding? When I'm thinking about AZA guidelines for elephant
exactly.
care,
That's
for
the
example.
point I was going to make. Is well,
well-
they exist. I mean, we've got a situation where the recommended minima for elephant group sizes is 4. That doesn't reflect elephant group sizes in the wild. Elephant groups in the wild are multi-generational and interrelated. I'm not familiar with any that come close to a naturalistic group anywhere in captivity. Well, certainly not in Europe and North America. So yes, let's say you could tweak that. And this goes back to tinkering around the edges, as I mentioned earlier. You could make the minimum group size 5, and that is a progressive step, arguably. But it doesn't come close to the natural environment in which that species has evolved to live, and the grouping that it has evolved to interact with. So yes, there are some forward-thinking zoos that have already gone out of elephant keeping and should be applauded for doing so. As Rob points out, there are definitely individuals within the zoo industry who are at least uncertain, in some cases very opposed to elephant keeping, even though their zoo has elephants. And there are some zoos that have elephants, and we shouldn't overlook this. There are some zoos that have elephants because they're the last that they're ever going to have. And I know of at least one in the UK that is in that situation. And absolutely, that is fine. I mean, obviously, it would be great if that elephant had companionship. But if it truly is the last elderly elephant that couldn't be moved 20 feet, let alone to another facility, and they've promised to go out of the elephant business, then sure, there needs to be a certain element of acknowledgement for that. But I always worry when I hear about the idea of progressiveness in zoos, because it's light years behind catching up with what the animals have evolved to do.
I think, and I'm going to come to Adam, because I think just picking up on Rob's point about coming from range states, I mean, I think people might not be aware that elephants are, within recent years, still taken from the wild in order to be brought in. I mean, zoos will claim that animals are no longer taken from the wild, the vast majority, but elephants have been.
You're steering me again.
I'm just giving you a...
Part of your question, I think, was in relation to whether keeping elephants in groups shows some level of being progressive as opposed to keeping them in isolation. And I was going to suggest that sometimes there are groups that actually still come from the wild. And one example we had was in the U.S. With the San Diego Wild Animal Park, which is world-renowned. It's the San Diego Wild Animal Park, right? And I always say I'm just a guy from New York City originally, and I'm used to skyscrapers, and I don't know anything about sort of acreage, but I hear there's a couple of acres of land, and I imagine these rolling hills with beautiful trees and a really nice environment. And so the government of Swaziland, landlocked country in southern Africa, wanted to divest itself of some of its elephants because the elephants were competing in the protected areas with rhinos for space. And so they decided they were going to ship 11 elephants, which was nearly a third of the entire population of their elephants. They only had about 36, or 39, depending on which account of theirs you read, out of the country. And they said they were going to send them to zoos, 2 zoos in America, one of which was the San Diego Wild Animal Park. So they brought 7 in. And the way they did that was by claiming that if they didn't bring them in, they were going to be killed in the wild. They got the park's director to say, I have reserved refrigeration space for these elephants, meaning if you don't accept them, we're going to kill them. And so, long story short, they brought them in. But in order to get those 7 elephants in, they had to ship the older ones that they already had out. So they went to places like Chicago, which gets below freezing in the winter, and Utah. Those elephants are now dead. But we have this family of elephants that have come in. So even though they brought 7 in, and we know that elephants are social creatures, it doesn't make up for all the other issues about keeping elephants in captivity, such as the amount of room they have to roam, what their enclosures look like, in terms of environmental enrichment. In that case, you're only dealing with the isolation aspect. You're not dealing with all the other things that make having elephants in zoos negative. And I was amazed when I went to see those elephants that you have this 2-acre enclosure, something like that, 2 acres, 2.5 acres, which again I thought was going to be amazing, right? But it's not that big. But part of the problem is, in order to see those elephants, some Americans, shockingly, very lazy people. So you're going to take a train around the enclosure, right? So that cuts in to some of that 2.5 acres, right? God forbid you should have to walk. So there's a tram area. But then I also noticed, looking at the other side of the enclosure, where all the trees are, a rope. And I asked the guy who worked at the San Diego Wild Animal Park why there was a rope there. And his answer was, because if we don't rope that off, the elephants will go into the trees and they'll rip the bark off the trees. And of course, most people who know anything about elephants would know that elephants rip bark off trees. It's just what they do. It's part of their nature. So again, we're taking them and putting them into an unnatural situation thousands of miles away from home in a group, but then we're preventing them from specifically doing one of their most natural things that they would do in the wild. So that just shows the sort of portfolio of problems with keeping them in zoos and why I don't think there's a way for zoos to be progressive in that regard. I think the only way zoos can be progressive is to stand up and say, you know what, we've actually been wrong, we can't do this, and we care enough about these elephants to let them go, to live with Ed and in other sanctuaries in the world. That's the progressive move.
And just to add to that, we have an example of that in the Detroit Zoo.
Yeah, there have been multiple zoos in America that have either closed their elephant exhibit, Oakland Zoo, Detroit Zoo, committed to do so, the Bronx Zoo. So it happens. And you know, it's interesting, I think Rob mentioned a minute ago this sort of the fear of the slippery slope, that, you know, if we get rid of elephants in the zoo, then it's going to be other animals. You know, I actually think zookeepers and zoo apologists and zoo officials and zoo industry, they would do themselves a great service by closing down the elephant exhibits, by recognizing that there's no way to keep elephants properly in a zoo enclosure. I just think it would show that they are progressive. And then, you know, if I come after them for their snakes, well, it's a different story. But at least they can do right by the elephants.
Chinny, do you have any sort of thoughts and reflections on where the zoos, perhaps in this country in particular, have progressed at all, or is it something?
Well, I don't think it's possible, as far as elephants are concerned, which is what we're talking about, to really progress. And I think that actually those zoos that have decided not to keep elephants any longer should be applauded for that, because they have understood about the nature of elephants, what we are doing to elephants by keeping them as we do, even in a group of 4. I mean, 4 humans who are living together don't always get on with each other. Why do they assume that these 4 elephants are big buddies? Absolutely no way. These 4 elephants also may have problems with each other. We assume things we shouldn't assume. We should actually, if we really, really genuinely care about these animals, we should actually look deep inside and say, we can never, never, never do enough to fulfill these animals. Certainly we should never take them from the wild. And the ones we have now, we ought to give a decent as life as possible while they end their days, maybe enrich it in some way, and there must be some way, and then we will stop. And I tell you, if the story is told right, and it's always about how the story is told, that's what matters, how you tell the story. If the story is told right, I bet you, all these people, a little Johnny who's taken to the zoo every Sunday, oh, look, darling, here's an elephant. Oh, isn't that great? No, it's not great. It's a nightmare for that elephant. If the story is told right, even little Johnny will say, Mom, I don't want to see an elephant anymore. It's cruel to keep this elephant on its own. How the story is told, and hasn't it been told well in this film, how the story is told will help to change the attitude of the people who want to keep elephants, own elephants. You can't own an animal really, not its soul, and they do have them. And I think that that's the true way forward. We ask the people who have zoos, keep elephants, to see the light and to back. We should back all those keepers who have seen the light and support them to say, this is the end of the line, no more.
Quite right. This lady here, and then one at the back, and I don't know how we're doing on time. I'm just double checking here. So yes, I think we'll probably call this the last two.
Just a question to Tariq, and I wondered whether you'd asked zoos to contribute to the film and whether that might be something you included in a longer version if you do one.
Well, see, that's a very good question. We didn't want to make this a confrontation. It's not a confrontation. This is a story which hasn't been told. There's a lot of great documentaries out there, and sometimes you watch it and you think, well, where's the other half of the story? They're not telling that story. We're telling the story of captive elephants being kept in isolation. That's happening. It's not, for example, in Blackfish, they did that a lot. They brought in. Perhaps it's a good question. If we were to make this a longer version, I would definitely revisit that question. But in this particular version, we weren't telling the story from the point of view of the zoos, and it wasn't a confrontation. This by itself is perhaps enough information for a 15-minute film. That's what I'd say.
Mm. And I won't come to everyone on the question of what the content of a longer film might be, and that's a very good question, but I think that, you've pretty much summed it up, open to persuasion that a longer version would cover and Rob's already touched on many of the issues that you just simply couldn't get into the short form.
Thank you. It's a twofold question. The first part is, do we know how many elephants are kept in solitary confinement worldwide? And secondly, in talking about elephants as social creatures, and I'm sure it's a spectrum, but are they the most social land mammal, or which other animals are extremely social as well? Is there a gauge as such?
Rob, no, Chris, let's start with you on that.
Okay. Well, I will answer the first part of that and hand it next to Rob, perhaps. In terms of the number of elephants in isolation globally, anybody's guess, I'm afraid. It's obviously particularly Asian elephants in range countries where there's a lot of there's a big captive population. A large number will be kept in isolation. The other thing I should point out, the figure of 43 or so, that is elephants where that is situations where there is one elephant at one facility. There are more elephants in isolation even in Europe, where let's say a zoo has 3 elephants and they keep 2 in one enclosure and 1 separately. There's no way of gauging that accurately, so this is an underestimate, I'm afraid. This is meant to be just the tip of the iceberg, the very worst of the worst, and I think Tariq and the guys did a great job of showing just how bad it is in terms of which is the most social creature. Obviously, there's various metrics used, to do the size of various parts of the brain, but I think elephants are pretty much up there, particularly in land mammals, as you say. Yeah. Rob, what are your thoughts on that?
I would. European and North American population together is over 1,000. I would say 1 in 10 of those is probably solitary.
Mm.
The solitary males very often get alone, and very often you have females that don't get on with others because of the way they were brought up. And then you've got these duos where they have an African and an Asian kept together. There's 6 pairs of those in Europe, and so they could effectively count as solitary as well. It's probably about one. And then if you look into Asia, then there's just countless, 30,000 Asian elephants that are owned, wandering around streets in Bangkok, etc. And a lot of those are on the road. Although they do actually have a human companion very often in those cases. In terms of social, I think they're absolutely up there. The 3 species of elephant and the great apes and the whales and some of the whales and dolphins are all highly sociable, and humans as well, another species of great apes. So we're all much of a muchness. There's differences in style of communication. Yeah. But when you think that an elephant's brain is such that, as it said on, they can recognise the calls of 200. Imagine the computing ability that they've got, and why they use that is because their societies stay together, and then they split up for a while, and they'll see other people or relatives they might not have seen for a year, and they come back together again. Very, very similar to the way humans operate, and their brains can cope with that. And even I mean, it's a slightly cruel experiment, but once somebody played back tape recordings of animals that had died 2 years before, which must have been kind of upsetting, I would think, but they still recognised them. So 2 years on, they could still remember the cause. So they had this tremendous, as Virginia has said, this ability to grieve and to mourn. They recognise the bones of their own species, but they don't bother with those of antelope. Everything points to them being highly socially complex, and that's why it can be living hell.
Virginia, do you know? I was just sort of thinking that we were all privileged to hear Joyce speak, and Joyce, together with Cynthia Moss and Soila and Nora and Katito and others who've worked, and various other people who've worked in Africa and in Kenya on the longest running study of wild elephants in the world. It's now 35 years and counting. What they've done, apart from present us with information and data and understanding, is that they've actually exposed our inability to really understand and communicate with nature, because in a sense the more that we study in the wild, the more we understand animals in the context of their natural habitat, in the context of their own social environment. It sort of makes us realise that it's not that they don't understand us, it's just that we're rather limited in our ability to communicate in ways that they communicate, and it's not just about sound, whether it's ultrasonic or infrasonic or body language or whatever it happens to be. And luckily, with those people and with Jane Goodall and Baruti Galdikas and Diane Fossey and others, those people have opened all these little windows into the world of a non-human species and allowed us at last to empathise with the species in a way that perhaps we can't and couldn't before. And that will change. I think that will play a fundamental role in changing our perspective, because once we really understand how elephants are, then we cannot let elephants be in a zoo in the way that we've seen today. Well, is that a reasonable nodding on that side? I don't know if we're staying on for a second. Shane, Adam, do you want to just wrap up with a word or two?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, if I may. Just one thing I disagree with Will about was at the beginning of his introduction of the panel, he referred to Tariq as a budding filmmaker, and I have to say, after seeing that film in full for the first time, I don't think you put the word budding in that film, and I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting here with you. And I say that because, I've been doing this work a long time. I've been doing this work almost 25 years, trying to affect the way we look at animals and trying to affect change for animals in a positive way, and legislatures and at government level and at the grassroots level. And I think it's really important, especially for someone like me, to have these moments of inspiration, which, you get into a rut year after year doing the same work and having it be really hard work. And so I just want to say, in all honesty, thank you for doing this, because you've given me a little bit of inspiration to carry on when I go back to my office. So I appreciate it. And congratulations.
Great honor.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Ask you to, if you wouldn't mind, just put your hands together again for Tariq.
I'd just like to say a few words about that. Thank you so much. I couldn't have done it without all of your help, Dr. Rob Atkinson, Chris Draper, Virginia McKenna. Such an inspiration. Thank you so much. Of course, yourself, Adam, and Will Travers, who helped with his time, his resources, selflessly. So thank you so much. I couldn't have done it without my great team, Amanda, producer, Emma on camera, and Matthew. We actually had to split up. We were so tight on money. When we went to different places, instead of going as a group in 4, we split as 3s. So there was the occasion when we had to go to America and drop one. It was a bit, there were those moments, but we did it. And on that note, actually, whilst I'm saying it, there's a couple of people in the audience I'd really like to draw people's attention to. We'll start with the image that you're seeing everywhere. This beautiful photograph of this elephant. As you can see, showing up here. It was taken by Robert Back, who's sitting right there. Fantastic photograph. very, very generously, just gave it to us basically. So really generous. There's also another filmmaker in the room who hasn't been acknowledged, and that's Nana Huskisson. She's over there at the back. She made another film called Zoocosis, which talks about stereotypy, which you may have seen it. You noticed in the film about the mental trauma that elephants develop, basically, or well, there's different theories about what it actually is, but regardless, I think Nana's film goes into much more details. It's called Zoocosis. You can see it actually on her website, but also on our website. Our website is lefilm.eu, and her website is, I think, zoocosismovie.org. But anyway, you can all access it if you get into the portal, and it'll take you there. Then there's also a couple of other people I'd like to thank, or organisations. Of course, first and foremost, the Born Free Foundation for making this possibility. I'd like to thank, there were a couple of people who are not here. Elephant Voices, I'd like to thank. That's the organisation run by Dr. Joyce Poole and her husband in Norway and Africa. And I'd like to thank Warner Brothers Creative Talent, who contributed some of the resources to make this film. Amanda's actually a recipient of that scholarship, so that was fantastic. And then through that we got this venue, which they kindly, very kindly offered to us. This fantastic venue, Warner Brothers Lane Lea. There may be, I'm worried, Amanda, I'm just going to ask you if you could remind me if there's anyone I'm forgetting, because I don't want to, I really don't. Sorry? ADI, so there's been ADI. I mean, there were a couple of organisations who were involved in providing us some of the material that you saw. You know, a film is a collaborative process. You need a lot of voices, a lot of input, and we worked tirelessly to tell the story. So we really hope it did justice to the story, and will be the beginning rather than the end of the process of getting the message out there. So again, thank you all very much for coming. Please do use the hashtag #EliFilm. I'm not going to lift it up again, you know what it is. And there we are. And if possible, if there's anything we need to ask, we're completely available to contact. All the details are in the booklet, which is why it's very important you have it. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.